In the quietest corners of history, where moonlight once touched herb gardens tended by gentle hands, there lived souls whose whispers could heal, whose knowledge bloomed like chamomile in forgotten meadows. Tonight we discover one such presence, a woman whose name the scribes may have overlooked, but whose touch brought comfort to countless hearts through the soft science of leaves and roots and petals. Whether you're nestled beneath warm covers in a city that never sleeps, or resting in countryside silence where stars still remember her story, I hope you've found that perfect position where your body can truly surrender to rest. And if these gentle words bring you the peace you seek tonight, perhaps a quiet like would help others discover this same tranquility. Feel your shoulders releasing now, letting go of whatever weight they've carried through the day. Notice how your breath naturally slows as you settle deeper into comfort. The pillow beneath your head knows exactly how to hold you, and any thoughts still swirling from your day can simply drift away like dandelion seeds on an evening breeze. We are floating back through centuries now, back to a time when villages nestled into valleys like sleeping children, when herb gardens grew behind cottage walls, and healing happened through patient wisdom passed from mother to daughter in whispers softer than summer rain. The year unfolds somewhere near 1300, though exact dates matter less than the feeling of morning mist rising from thatched roofs, in a village whose name has dissolved into time's gentle forgetting. There lived a girl called Marjorie, though some would later know her as the herb woman, the gentle healer, or simply the one who knew. Picture, if you will, a small dwelling at the edge of the settlement where wild meadow meets cultivated earth. The walls are wattle and daub, breathing with the seasons, keeping cool shade in summer, holding hearth warmth through winter's long quietness. Behind this humble home, a garden grows with intention and tenderness. Rows upon rows of healing plants, each one known by touch, by scent, by the particular way its leaves catch morning dew. Marjorie's childhood unfolded here like mint spreading through shaded soil, slow and steady and sure. Her mother Anne moved through their garden with the quietness of someone who understood that plants, like frightened creatures, responded better to gentleness than haste. Young Marjorie would follow, her small fingers learning the texture of feverfew leaves, fuzzy and soft, the smooth coolness of comfrey, the delicate lacework of yarrow fronds. Feel this one, her mother would whisper, guiding tiny hands toward chamomile flowers that bobbed like small suns in the evening light. Close your eyes and know it by touch alone, for sometimes darkness comes when healing is most needed. The child would stand there, eyes closed, fingers reading, the plant like a precious manuscript written in petals and stems. The cottage itself breathed with the rhythm of herbs drying. Bundles of lavender hung from every beam, releasing their scent with each gentle draft that wandered through. Shelves lined the wall, holding clay vessels and wooden boxes, each containing treasures. Dried elderflowers for fever, willow bark for pain, meadow sweet for the stomach's troubles. The air itself seemed thick with healing, heavy with the accumulated wisdom of generations. In those earliest years, Marjorie learned through watching, observing, absorbing. She saw how her mother's hands moved when crushing rosemary between her palms, releasing oils that could clear a troubled mind. She noticed the particular way Anne would hum while preparing tinctures. A low, steady sound that seemed to infuse the medicine with calmness itself. These lessons came not through formal teaching, but through presence, through being there in the quiet moments when knowledge passed like breath from one generation to the next. The village around them moved in patterns old as the hills themselves. Farmers rose with first light, their movements slow and purposeful. Children played in dusty lanes until their mothers called them home for evening porridge. The church bell marked the hours with bronze notes that settled into the valley like birds coming to roost. And through it all, people knew that when illness came calling, when babies wouldn't stop crying, or wounds wouldn't heal, or fevers burned too bright, they would make their way to the cottage at the meadow's edge. Marjorie remembered her first patient, though patient seems too formal a word for the injured sparrow she found beneath the apple tree. 6 summers old, she had cradled the tiny creature in cupped palms, feeling its rapid heartbeat against her skin. Her mother had shown her how to create a nest of soft wool and dried grass, how to drop water mixed with crushed seeds onto its tongue using a reed. For 3 days, the child barely left the bird's side, whispering to it stories of flying through cloudless skies. On the 4th morning, it flexed its wings and took flight, disappearing into the vast blue above. Something shifted in Marjorie that day, an understanding that healing required patience, presence, and a peculiar kind of faith. As seasons turned like pages in an illuminated manuscript, the girl grew into her knowledge. Her fingers lengthened, becoming more skilled at separating tiny seeds from their husks. Her sense of smell sharpened until she could identify herbs with her eyes closed. Mugwort from wormwood, sage from thyme, each plant revealing itself through its particular perfume. Her mother began allowing her to help with simple preparations, grinding dried peppermint for digestive troubles, mixing honey with horehound for winter coughs. The garden expanded with Marjorie's understanding. Where once there had been simple rows of common herbs, now grew specimens gathered from traveling merchants and pilgrims. Seeds of exotic plants from the Holy Land, cuttings from monastery gardens where monks preserved ancient knowledge. Each new addition required learning, understanding its needs for sun or shade, wet or dry soil, companionship with other plants or solitary space. The village accepted their herb women as naturally as they accepted sunrise and rainfall. Yet there existed an undercurrent of careful distance. Healing women walked a delicate path in those times, respected for their knowledge, needed for their skills, yet watched with cautious eyes by those who feared what they didn't understand. Anne taught her daughter to move quietly through the world, to heal without drawing attention, to help without claiming credit. "We are like the roots beneath the soil," she would say, her voice barely above a whisper as they worked side by side, preparing remedies by candlelight. Essential but unseen, our work happens in darkness and silence, bringing life to what grows above. Young Marjorie absorbed this lesson deeply, understanding even then that their survival depended on remaining humble, helpful, and largely invisible. Winter evenings brought different lessons. When snow blanketed the garden and fresh herbs slept beneath frozen earth, mother and daughter would sit by the fire, working with dried stores. These were the hours for learning the more complex preparations: how to extract essences using gentle heat, how to blend multiple herbs for synergistic effects, how to preserve potency through proper storage. The fire would burn low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, while knowledge passed between them, soft as smoke. Marjorie learned to read bodies the way others read scripture. The particular shade of pale that suggested blood loss versus the grayness that came with poor digestion. The way fever made eyes bright and restless versus the dull look of chronic fatigue. How swollen joints told different stories depending on their heat and color. This diagnostic art came not from books, for neither woman could read the Latin texts that monks guarded in their scriptoriums, but from careful observation passed down through generations of healing women. The child grew into adolescence with dirt beneath her fingernails and the scent of herbs in her hair. Village boys might have noticed her gentle beauty, the way sunlight caught the auburn in her brown hair, the grace with which she moved through the garden paths. But Marjorie's focus remained elsewhere. She was learning to feel the pulse of life in all growing things, to understand the subtle communications between plants and those who tended them. Her mother introduced her gradually to the human aspects of healing. First, she would simply be present during consultations, grinding herbs in the corner while Anne spoke with visitors. She learned the importance of listening, really listening, not just to symptoms, but to the fears and sorrows that often lay beneath physical ailments. She saw how her mother's presence alone could begin the healing process. How a gentle touch on a worried mother's shoulder could do as much good as any tincture. The cottage became Marjorie's university, though no one would have used such a word. Every corner held lessons. The art of organization, keeping each herb in its proper place so it could be found even in darkness. The discipline of daily garden tending, regardless of weather or mood. The patience required for long preparation. Some remedies taking months to properly mature. The courage needed to stay calm when someone arrived with injuries that made the stomach turn. There were failures too, woven into the fabric of learning. Plants that withered despite careful tending. Remedies that didn't bring the expected relief. The hardest lessons came with those beyond helping. The old man whose lungs had filled with fluid beyond what any herb could drain. The infant whose fever burned too fast and bright for cooling herbs to quench. These experiences taught Marjorie about limits, about acceptance, about the grace required to be present with suffering even when healing wasn't possible. As her 15th summer approached, Marjorie had developed her own quiet confidence. She could identify over 100 healing plants by sight, touch, and smell. She knew which phase of the moon was best for harvesting different herbs, understood how morning dew enhanced certain properties while midday sun concentrated others. Her hands had developed their own wisdom, knowing just how much pressure to apply when expressing oils, exactly how fine to grind different roots for optimal extraction. The villagers began to notice her particularly, separate from her mother's shadow. "Young Marjorie has the touch," they would say, watching her gentle way with colicky babies or her patient tending of festering wounds. Some of the elder women, those who remembered Anne's mother and grandmother, would nod knowingly. "It runs in the blood," they would whisper. The knowing passes from mother to daughter, like the color of eyes or the shape of hands. But Marjorie's education extended beyond the purely practical. Her mother taught her the prayers to whisper while harvesting, not the Latin of the church, but older words, syllables that seemed to rise from the earth itself. She learned the importance of gratitude, thanking each plant for its sacrifice, acknowledging the partnership between human need and botanical generosity. These rituals might have seemed strange to the learned men in their monasteries, but they created a rhythm of respect that made the healing more complete. The garden at the meadow's edge had become a small paradise of purpose. Butterflies danced among the flowering herbs, bees hummed, their contentment drunk on lavender nectar. Birds nested in the elder bushes, their songs providing nature's own healing music. Sometimes Marjorie would simply sit among the plants in the evening light, feeling the day's warmth radiating from the earth, listening to the whispered conversations between leaf and wind. The summer of her 16th year arrived with unusual heaviness in the air, clouds gathering but never quite releasing their burden. It was during this suspended season that Marjorie's true calling revealed itself through circumstances no one could have foreseen. A merchant's caravan had stopped at the village, bringing goods from distant markets, and with them, a sickness that spread like spilled ink across parchment. The fever came first to the children, as these things often do. Their small bodies burned with unnatural heat, while chills made them shake like autumn leaves. Then it found the elderly, those whose strength had already been worn thin by years of labor. The village priest rang the church bells calling for prayers, but prayers alone couldn't cool the fever or ease the terrible aching that made grown men weep. Anne and Marjorie worked without rest, moving from cottage to cottage like shadows in the pre-dawn darkness. They carried baskets heavy with willow bark for the fever, elderflower to promote sweating, chamomile to calm the restless anxiety that accompanied the illness. But supplies ran thin, and Anne herself began showing the telltale flush across her cheeks. "You must continue," Anne whispered to her daughter, her own hands trembling as she tried to prepare one more batch of medicine. "The knowledge lives in you now. Trust what your hands know. Trust what the plants tell you." She collapsed that evening, adding herself to the growing number of sick, leaving Marjorie to face the crisis alone. Standing in the garden under stars that seemed impossibly distant, the young woman felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a cloak made of centuries. She closed her eyes and let her awareness sink into the earth beneath her feet, feeling for that deep wisdom her mother had always spoken of. And in that stillness, an understanding arose, not dramatic or sudden, but gentle as morning mist. She began working with a methodical calmness that surprised even herself. Combining herbs in proportions she had never been specifically taught but somehow knew. Adding meadowsweet to the willow bark, creating a more complete fever reduction. Mixing plantain with honey and wine to create a poultice that drew infection from the worst cases. Her hands moved with inherited certainty, guided by the accumulated knowledge of generations flowing through her blood. The days blurred together. Marjorie barely slept, catching brief moments of rest while tinctures steeped or water boiled. She developed a routine that maximized her efforts. Visiting the park, sickest in the deep night when fever peaked, preparing medicines in the pre-dawn hours when the air was clearest, tending her garden in whatever spare moments emerged. The villagers watched this slip of a girl transform into something more, a conduit for healing that seemed to come from beyond her years. Word of her efforts reached the monastery on the hill above the village. The monks there maintained their own herbarium, their own traditions of healing, all carefully documented in Latin texts that Marjorie would never read. Brother Thomas, the monastery's infirmarian, came to observe this young woman, whose methods were saving lives that conventional treatments had failed to help. He found her crushing fresh feverfew leaves, the bitter scent filling the cottage. "Where did you learn this combination?" he asked, noting how she mixed the feverfew with ground ginger and honey, creating a paste that seemed particularly effective for the headaches that accompanied the fever. Marjorie looked up at him with eyes hollowed by exhaustion, but bright with purpose. "The plants teach if we listen," she said simply, returning to her work. The monk watched her for a long moment, recognizing something in her movements, a fluidity of knowledge that couldn't be learned from books alone. He left without saying more, but later, in the monastery's records, he would write of the young woman whose hands carry ancient wisdom. Anne recovered slowly, weak but alive, to find her daughter had not only maintained their practice but had somehow deepened it. The fever eventually released its grip on the village, leaving gratitude in its wake. Gifts appeared at the cottage door. A chicken here, a measure of grain there, a length of good wool for the coming winter. But more importantly, Marjorie had earned something beyond payment. She had earned trust. The following years saw Marjorie's reputation spread like ripples on a pond. Visitors came from neighboring villages, then from market towns, eventually from places whose names she had only heard in passing. They came seeking remedies for ailments that had resisted other treatments, chronic pains that had lasted years, digestive troubles that left people unable to eat, women's concerns that were spoken of only in whispers. She developed specialties that set her apart. A particular talent for treating the melancholy that sometimes settled over people like fog. Using St. John's wort combined with gentle conversation and the prescription of time spent in sunlight. She discovered that skullcap and passion flower, when properly prepared, could ease the anxious trembling that kept some villagers from sleeping. Her remedy for joint pain, using meadow saffron in quantities so precise that the line between medicine and poison was thread thin, became legendary. But Marjorie understood that healing involved more than herbs. She developed rituals that gave people agency in their own recovery. Having them participate in gathering certain plants under specific conditions. A woman seeking fertility would collect red clover at dawn. A man with lung troubles would harvest mullein under the full moon. These acts might have seemed superstitious to the learned physicians in their city colleges, but Marjorie understood the power of involvement, of hope, made tangible through action. The cottage evolved to match her growing practice. Additional rooms were carefully added, each serving specific purposes. A still room for distillation and extraction. A drying room where temperature and airflow could be precisely controlled. A consultation space separate from the family quarters, where visitors could speak freely about their troubles. The garden tripled in size, with sections devoted to different categories of healing plants. Those for the body, those for the mind, those for the spirit. Marjorie never married. Those suitors presented themselves. The blacksmith's son with his strong hands and gentle manner. The merchant who offered a life of comfort and travel. But she understood that her path required a different kind of commitment. Her mother, growing older now, silver threading through her hair like moonlight, supported this choice. Some are called to tend families, she would say. Others to tend the larger human garden. The relationship between the cottage and the monastery became quietly symbiotic. Brother Thomas would sometimes send patients whose ailments seemed to resist prayer and conventional treatment. In return, Marjorie would share observations about the effects of certain preparations, information the monks would carefully record in their herbalist texts, though always attributed to local practice, rather than naming her specifically. She began training other women, carefully and quietly. Young girls whose mothers recognized the spark of healing gift. Widows seeking purpose and income after loss. Always the teaching happened informally, described as help with the garden, rather than medical instruction. The church might have looked suspiciously on a woman teaching medicine, but helping with gardening was acceptable women's work. One of her most devoted students was Elizabeth, a widow whose husband had died in a farming accident. Elizabeth had a natural intuition for the emotional aspects of healing, understanding how grief and fear could manifest as physical ailments. Under Marjorie's guidance, she developed particular skill in treating children, her gentle presence calming even the most frightened little ones. The seasons continued their eternal rotation, each bringing its own health challenges and herbal responses. Spring with its renewal, but also its allergies, requiring nettle and elderflower preparations. Summer's abundance, but also its digestive upsets from spoiled food, calling for peppermint and ginger remedies. Autumn's harvest and its accidents, it's needing comfrey for bones and calendula for wounds. Winter's stillness and its respiratory troubles, demanding thyme and elecampane tinctures. Marjorie developed a form of record keeping that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Symbols carved into wooden tablets that looked decorative but actually tracked patient histories. Knots in hanging cords that recorded successful remedy combinations. Patterns in her garden planting that served as a living library of pharmacological knowledge. To the casual observer, these appeared to be merely the quirks of a cottage herbalist. But they represented a sophisticated system of medical documentation. As her experience deepened, so did her understanding of the subtle energetics of healing. How the same plant harvested at different times could have vastly different effects. How the healing intention of the practitioner affected the remedy's potency. How the patient's belief in recovery was as important as any herb. These insights couldn't be proven by the methods of her time, but she saw their truth repeated in countless healings. She began to perceive illness differently, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as communication from the body. Messages written in symptoms. Chronic headaches might speak of unexpressed anger. Digestive troubles could indicate difficulty digesting life experiences. Breathing problems sometimes reflected grief that couldn't be exhaled. This understanding led her to treat the whole person rather than isolated symptoms. An approach that seemed radical to some, but produced remarkable results. The local priest, Father Benedict, maintained an interesting relationship with the healing women. Officially, he preached that illness was God's will and healing came through prayer. Privately, he would send his housekeeper to the cottage for remedies when his own joints ached or his stomach rebelled. This delicate dance of public distance and private reliance was performed throughout the village. Everyone knowing but no one acknowledging the vital role these women played. Marjorie's middle years brought a depth of understanding that only experience could provide. She had seen enough cycles of birth and death, illness and recovery to recognize patterns that younger healers might miss. The way certain ailments ran in family lines, how emotional shocks could trigger physical symptoms years later. The seasonal rhythms of community health that seemed tied to more than just weather. She developed what would later be called preventive medicine, though she simply thought of it as wisdom, recommending specific herbs to be taken before the usual season of illness, suggesting dietary changes that could prevent common ailments, teaching breathing practices that strengthen the body's natural defenses. These proactive approaches seemed almost magical to those accustomed to seeking help only after illness struck. The garden had become a complex ecosystem, deliberately cultivated to support not just healing, but the entire web of life. Plants that attracted beneficial insects were interspersed with medicinal herbs. Corners were left wild to harbor the creatures that controlled pests. Birdhouses encouraged aerial predators of harmful insects. The entire space hummed with life, a demonstration that healing and harmony were intimately connected. Years folded into one another like soft fabric, each season adding another layer to Marjorie's understanding. Her hair, once the rich brown of freshly turned earth, now showed strands of silver that caught moonlight when she worked late into the evening, preparing medicines by the gentle glow of beeswax candles. The lines around her eyes had deepened, each one earned through nights spent watching over the sick, days spent bending among the herb beds, moments of joy when a remedy brought relief to suffering. The cottage at the meadow's edge had become something of a landmark. Travelers would speak of it in distant markets. You know you're approaching the village when you smell the lavender from the healer's garden, they would say. And indeed, the scent seemed to travel on every breeze, carrying its calming influence far beyond the physical boundaries of the planted rose. Sometimes pilgrims would detour from their holy journeys just to purchase a small bundle of herbs, blessed, they believed, by the healing hands that had tended them. Marjorie's influence spread in ways she never fully knew. The women she had trained carried her methods to their own villages when they married or moved. Seeds from her garden were planted in distant soil, growing into new healing spaces tended by other gentle hands. Her remedies, passed along through whispered recommendations, helped people she would never meet, in places she would never see. This quiet diaspora of knowledge spread like underground roots, invisible but vital. The monastery's records from this period, though they never mentioned her by name, showed a marked decrease in deaths from common ailments in the surrounding region. Brother Thomas, now elderly himself, had developed a deep respect for what he privately called the parallel tradition. He understood that the healing happening in Marjorie's cottage represented something the monastery's formal medicine couldn't quite capture. An intuitive wisdom that complemented their documented learning. Elizabeth had become Marjorie's primary assistant, her own skills having flourished under years of patient guidance. Together, they developed new preparations, discovering that certain herbs worked better in partnership than alone. That valerian and hops together brought deeper sleep than either could achieve separately. That combining echinacea with elderberry created a powerful defense against winter ailments. These synergistic discoveries happened through careful observation, trial and gentle error, always with the welfare of their patients as the guiding star. The rhythm of their days had settled into a peaceful pattern. Mornings spent in the garden when the air was still cool and plants were most receptive to harvesting. Afternoons dedicated to preparation, grinding, mixing, brewing, distilling. Evenings for consultations, when people could visit after their day's labor was complete. The work was constant but unhurried, flowing like a slow river that knows its destination. Marjorie had begun to notice how the younger visitors looked at her, with the same mixture of respect and slight fear she had once observed toward her own mother. She had become the wise woman, the keeper of mysteries, the one who knew things that couldn't be learned from books. This recognition brought both satisfaction and a kind of loneliness. The isolation that comes with being seen as somehow apart from ordinary life. But she found companionship in unexpected places. The plants themselves seemed to communicate more clearly as she aged, their needs and gifts revealing themselves with greater subtlety. She could walk through the garden in complete darkness and know each plant by its presence alone. The particular way each one held space, breathed, existed in relationship with its neighbors. This communion went beyond the practical knowledge of herbalism into something more profound, a recognition of the living consciousness that animated all growing things. The cottage received a distinguished visitor one autumn afternoon. Lady Catherine, wife of the regional lord, arrived in a covered cart, seeking help for an ailment that her husband's physicians had been unable to cure. The persistent melancholy that had settled over her after the loss of a child. making food taste like ash, sleep impossible, joy a distant memory. The learned doctors had prescribed purging and bloodletting, treatments that left her weaker but no less sorrowful. Marjorie received the noblewoman without ceremony, gesturing for her to sit on the same simple stool where farmers' wives and merchants' daughters had sat. She listened to the story of loss with the same complete attention she gave to every visitor. Then she began preparing a special blend: motherwort for the heart's grief, lemon balm for the spirit's darkness, rose petals for self-compassion, hawthorn for emotional strength. As she worked, she spoke quietly of how grief needed to move through the body like weather through the sky, honored but not held. Lady Catherine returned weekly for 2 months, not just for the herbal preparations, but for the particular quality of understanding she found in the cottage. The absence of judgment, the recognition that nobility of birth didn't protect one from the common sorrows of human existence. Gradually, color returned to her cheeks, appetite to her body, the ability to speak her child's name without shattering. When she finally departed, she left a purse of gold that Marjorie immediately distributed among the village's poorest families. Word of the noblewoman's healing brought unexpected consequences. Other wealthy visitors began arriving, offering substantial payment for treatments. But Marjorie maintained her practice of seeing anyone who came, regardless of ability to pay. The wealthy subsidized the poor without knowing it. Their gold transformed into medicines for those who could offer only vegetables from their gardens or prayers for the healer's well-being. As winter settled over the land that year, bringing its familiar cloak of snow and silence, Marjorie began experiencing a persistent cough that her usual remedies couldn't quite resolve. She treated it with thyme and coltsfoot, mullein and marshmallow root. But the tickle in her chest remained, speaking perhaps of too many winters spent over steaming preparations, too many cold mornings in the garden, too many nights of interrupted sleep to tend the sick. Elizabeth noticed her mentor moving more slowly, pausing to rest when climbing the gentle slope to the garden's upper reaches. But Marjorie continued her work with the same steady dedication, understanding perhaps that her time for active healing was entering its final season. She began spending more time teaching, ensuring that Elizabeth and the other women fully understood not just the what, but the why of each preparation. The following spring arrived with unusual gentleness, as if nature itself recognized the need for softness. Marjorie found herself spending long hours simply sitting in the garden, watching the interplay of sun and shadow, feeling the pulse of new growth pushing through warmed soil. Her hands, which had been constantly busy for so many years, learned the art of stillness, resting in her lap like birds that had finally found their roost. She began dictating her knowledge to Elizabeth, who had learned enough letters to make simple records, though the words were basic and the spelling inconsistent. These documents represented something precious, the first written account of this healing tradition from the perspective of those who practiced it, rather than filtered through the Latin interpretations of monastery scribes. These were the direct words of the wise woman herself. "Remember always," she would say, her voice softer now but carrying the weight of decades of experience, that healing is not conquering, it is cooperating. We do not force the body to health. We remind it of its own knowledge of wholeness. The herbs are not weapons against disease. They are invitations for the body to remember its natural state. Elizabeth would nod, scratching these words onto precious parchment, understanding that she was preserving something sacred. The summer solstice that year found the garden in extraordinary bloom, as if every plant had decided to offer its most abundant flowering as a gift. The air hummed with bees. Butterflies painted moving mandalas through the herb beds. Birds sang from every available perch. Marjorie sat in the center of this abundance, feeling herself becoming part of the garden's rhythm. Her breathing synchronized with the gentle wind. Her heartbeat aligned with the deeper pulse of the earth. Visitors still came, but increasingly they were directed to Elizabeth for active treatment. Marjorie would sometimes join the consultations, adding a word of guidance here, a gentle correction there. But more often she simply held space, her presence alone seeming to catalyze healing. People would later say that just sitting near her brought a peculiar peace, as if her years of service had transformed her into a living benediction. She began preparing her final garden, not the physical one that bloomed around the cottage, but the metaphorical garden of knowledge she would leave behind. Each woman she had trained was like a seed that would carry the tradition forward. Each remedy she had developed was a variety that would continue to flourish in other hands. Each person she had healed would remember and share what they had learned about the power of plants and patience. The monastery recorded that year's harvest as exceptionally abundant, though they didn't note a connection to the healing woman whose garden had become a sanctuary for beneficial insects and birds that protected the entire region's crops. They didn't document how her decades of organic cultivation had enriched the soil in ways that influenced the underground water, the air quality, the subtle environmental harmony that supported all growing things. As autumn approached with its familiar colors of gold and rust, Marjorie knew her own harvest time was near. She wasn't ill in any dramatic way, simply fading like a flower that had completed its cycle. She spent her days ensuring that everything important had been passed on, every remedy documented in some form, every cultivation secret shared, every subtle understanding transmitted to receptive hands and hearts. The village had changed around her over the decades. New buildings had risen, old families had died out or moved away. The world beyond the village had shifted too, with wars and plagues, the rise and fall of noble houses, changes in church doctrine. But through it all, the cottage at the meadow's edge had remained, a constant source of healing, a reliable refuge for those in need. Elizabeth would find her mentor one morning seated in her favorite spot in the garden, having passed some time in the night. Her face was peaceful, her hands resting on the earth she had tended for so long. The plants around her seemed to lean in, as if keeping vigil. The morning sun illuminated her silver hair like a crown of light. Birds sang their dawn chorus as if nothing had changed, and perhaps in the deeper rhythm of things, nothing had. The news of Marjorie's passing moved through the village like a gentle wave, not sudden nor shocking, but gradual, inevitable as autumn following summer. People gathered at the cottage not with the sharp grief that follows unexpected loss, but with the deeper sadness that comes when a long familiar presence finally fades, like the last warmth leaving stones after sunset. Elizabeth found comfort in the crowd of mourners, each one carrying a story of healing, a memory of kindness, a moment when Marjorie's knowledge had made the unbearable bearable. The funeral was unlike any the village had seen. The priest performed the official rites, of course, but there was something else happening, something older and deeper. Women came forward with bundles of herbs to place upon the grave, each bunch tied with thread, the color of different healing intentions: white for peace, blue for wisdom, green for growth that continues beyond individual lives. Men who would normally stand stoic at funerals wept openly, remembering childhood fevers broken, wounds that had healed clean instead of festering, the dignity of pain relieved, as the seasons turned and turned again. Elizabeth discovered that Marjorie's absence was not an emptiness but a different kind of presence. The cottage still smelled of herbs and healing. The garden continued its cycles of growth and rest. Patients still arrived seeking help, and Elizabeth found that her hands knew what to do, guided by years of watching, learning, absorbing the quiet wisdom that had been offered so generously. The garden itself seemed to hold Marjorie's essence. Plants she had tended for decades continued thriving, self-seeding and spreading in patterns that maintained the delicate balance she had cultivated. New healers would comment on the particular vitality of herbs grown in that soil, as if the earth itself had been transformed by the countless footsteps of one who walked with healing intention. The very ground had become medicine. Years drifted by like clouds across a summer sky. Elizabeth aged into the role of village healer, training new women as she herself had been trained. The cottage expanded again. Rooms added with the same organic flow that Marjorie had always favored, following the garden's needs rather than imposing rigid human geometry. Each addition was blessed with the same prayers Marjorie had whispered, the same intentions of service woven into timber and daub. The monastery's records from this period grew more detailed. Brother Thomas's successor, a younger monk named Brother Francis, had begun documenting the herbal practices more systematically. He would visit Elizabeth monthly, carefully noting the preparations being used, their effects, their seasons of gathering. Though he still didn't name the women directly, his writings preserved their knowledge in a form that would survive centuries. Hidden between Latin passages about divine providence were practical instructions for healing that had been developed in that cottage garden. New challenges arose that tested the continuation of Marjorie's tradition. A particularly harsh winter that killed many medicinal plants, requiring creative substitutions and careful rationing of dried stores. A summer drought that stressed the garden beyond anything in memory, teaching the importance of water conservation and the selection of hardy plant varieties. A traveling merchant who sold fraudulent herbs, reminding everyone why local knowledge and trusted sources were essential. Elizabeth began to experience, not visions exactly, but moments of profound knowing that seemed to come from beyond her own experience. She would be treating a patient and suddenly understand exactly which combination of herbs was needed, even if she had never used that particular blend before. Her hands would move with a certainty that surprised her, as if guided by an intelligence greater than her individual knowledge. Some of the older women nodded knowingly when she mentioned these experiences. "Marjorie's still teaching," they would say, "just from a different classroom now." The cottage became a pilgrimage site of sorts, though no one would have used such grand language. Healers from distant regions would arrive, having heard through the vast network of wise women about this place where the knowledge ran particularly deep. They would stay for days or weeks, learning not just recipes and techniques, but something more subtle, an approach to healing that recognized the sacred in the mundane, the profound in the simple act of tending plants. One visitor, an elderly woman from the northern mountains, brought seeds of rare alpine herbs that Marjorie had only heard described. Plants that grew where snow lingered into summer, where the air was thin and the sun particularly intense. These high-altitude medicines carried a different kind of potency, concentrated by extremity, and their incorporation into the cottage garden represented an evolution that Marjorie would have celebrated. The tradition growing beyond what any single practitioner could have imagined. Children who had been healed by Marjorie grew into adults who brought their own children to Elizabeth. 3 generations of connection, creating a continuity that transcended individual lives. These families carried stories that became gentler with each telling. How great-grandmother's fever broke after the Habe woman's visit. How grandfather's wounded leg healed without the corruption that took so many. How mother's difficult birth was eased by preparations and presents. Each story a thread in the larger tapestry of communal memory. The relationship between the cottage and the church evolved into something approaching partnership. The new priest, Father Andrew, had arrived from a monastery known for its medical learning. He recognized that the herbal tradition and religious healing weren't opposites, but complementary approaches to the divine mystery of wellness. He would sometimes refer to the cottage openly from the pulpit, calling the healing women servants of God's green medicine. This public acknowledgement, though carefully worded, provided a new level of protection for the practice. Elizabeth discovered papers that Marjorie had hidden in the cottage walls during renovation. Simple drawings of human bodies with herbs sketched beside different areas. A pregnancy calendar marked with supportive plants for each month. Lists of herb combinations with symbols indicating their effects. These documents, crude by monastery standards, represented something precious, indigenous medical knowledge recorded by the practitioners themselves. Elizabeth carefully preserved these papers, understanding their historical importance even if she couldn't articulate it. The garden had evolved into something that agricultural historians would later recognize as remarkably advanced. Companion planting that maximized both space and plant health. Natural pest control through beneficial insect habitat. Soil enrichment through careful composting and crop rotation. Water management that captured and utilized every drop of rain. These techniques, developed through decades of observation and experimentation, created yields that seemed miraculous to those practicing conventional agriculture. As Elizabeth entered her own elder years, her hair now white as chamomile flowers, she began the same process Marjorie had undertaken. The careful transmission of knowledge to the next generation. But now there were differences. more women could read and write, at least enough to keep basic records. The fear of persecution for healing work had diminished, though watchfulness remained necessary. The tradition could be slightly more open, though still clothed in the language of household medicine rather than professional healing. The woman Elizabeth chose as her primary successor was named Agnes, a widow whose sharp mind and gentle hands reminded everyone of Marjorie. Agnes had a particular gift for understanding the emotional components of illness, recognizing how unspoken fears could manifest as physical symptoms, how old griefs could lodge in the body like thorns, working their way gradually to the surface. She developed techniques for addressing these deeper causes, combining herbal remedies with careful conversation, creating space for tears that needed to fall. The cottage received an unexpected gift one autumn. Lady Catherine's daughter, now grown and married to a powerful lord, arrived with a chest of books, medical texts that her husband had collected from across Europe. Though written in Latin that neither Elizabeth nor Agnes could read fluently, the illustrations of plants were invaluable. They could compare their living specimens with these formal drawings, discovering that many of their remedies aligned with practices from distant lands. This validation, though they hadn't sought it, strengthened their confidence in the inherited wisdom. A young monk from the monastery began visiting regularly. Brother Marcus had been assigned to create an herbal for their library, and he recognized that the cottage garden contained varieties and knowledge not documented in any text. He would sit with Agnes for hours, carefully drawing each plant while she described its properties, uses, the stories attached to its cultivation. His illuminated manuscript would become one of the most comprehensive herbals of its time, though it credited only local traditions as its source. The village itself had grown into a small market town, buildings spreading outward from the original cluster, new trades and craftsmen arriving, a fuller's shop, a proper bakery, even a small school where children learned their letters. Yet the cottage at the meadow's edge remained unchanged in its essential character, still offering the same quiet refuge, the same patient healing, the same connection to something deeper than commercial progress. Winter evenings in the cottage took on a special quality. Agnes would gather the young women she was training, and they would sit by the fire while she told stories of Marjorie and Elizabeth. Not hagiographies, but real memories, mistakes made and learned from, discoveries that happened by accident, the very human process of becoming a healer. These stories served multiple purposes: preserving history, transmitting practical knowledge, and most importantly, inspiring confidence that wisdom wasn't inherited whole but accumulated slowly, patiently, like gardens growing season by season. The herbal preparations had become more sophisticated while maintaining their essential simplicity. Agnes developed a system of standardization, ensuring that remedies remained consistent in strength. She created seasonal production schedules, making certain medicines when plants were at their peak potency, storing them properly for year-round use. This systematization happened without losing the intuitive aspect, the listening to plants, the attention to individual needs that had always characterized the cottage practice. Sometimes in the very early morning when mist rose from the garden, or in the deep evening when shadows grew long and soft, visitors would speak of seeing a figure moving among the plants. Not frightening, but comforting. A presence that seemed to bless the continuing work. Whether this was Marjorie's spirit or simply the projection of grateful memory hardly mattered. The feeling of continuity, of being part of something larger than individual life, gave strength to those carrying on the tradition. The cottage's influence had spread far beyond what any single person could track. Seeds from the garden grew in plots throughout the region. Remedies developed there had been passed along trade routes, reaching people who had never heard of the village or its healers. Women trained in that tradition had married and moved, carrying their knowledge like dowries more valuable than gold. Each transmission changed slightly, adapted to new climates, new plants, new needs, but the core remained. The understanding that healing was as much about presence as prescription, as much about listening as administering. As the 15th century drew toward its close, the cottage stood as a testament to the power of quiet persistence. It had survived plagues and wars, changes in religious doctrine, shifts in political power. Through it all, the garden had continued growing. The remedies had continued healing. The knowledge had continued flowing from one set of hands to the next, like a river that might change its surface but never its essential nature. Agnes, now elderly herself, would sometimes stand where Marjorie once stood, looking out over the garden in the evening light. The same plants grew there, or their descendants. Feverfew still lifted its small white faces to the sun. Comfrey still spread its broad leaves in the shady corners. Lavender still released its fragrance on every breeze. But now, there were also new additions. Plants from distant lands that had found homes in this welcoming soil, just as new understanding had grafted onto ancient wisdom. The tradition would continue long after Agnes, through women whose names would be forgotten even as their work lived on, through times when such knowledge would be celebrated and times when it would be suppressed, through the rise of formal medicine that would first dismiss, then rediscover what the cottage healers had always known. The garden would eventually disappear, built over by progress. But its seeds had already spread so widely that destruction of one plot couldn't end what had begun. In the monastery library, Brother Marcus's herbal would survive centuries, consulted by scholars who would wonder at the detailed knowledge it contained, never knowing that its source was a cottage where women without formal education had developed a medical tradition as sophisticated as any university could teach. The illustrations he had drawn with such care would be copied and recopied, carrying Marjorie's garden forward in ink and parchment even after the living plants were gone. But that's all still to come. For now, in this gentle evening moment, the cottage stands peaceful in the fading light. Smoke rises from the chimney where remedies simmer. The garden settles into its evening quiet, broken only by the last songs of birds finding their roosts. Inside, Agnes tends to her preparations with the same patient attention that Marjorie once brought, that Elizabeth continued, that countless unnamed women had offered through the centuries. The story of the healer who whispered to herbs doesn't end. It simply dissolves into the larger story of all healing, all tending, all gentle service to life. Like chamomile tea steeping in hot water The essence spreads until it can't be separated from the whole. The cottage, the garden, the women who tended both, they become part of the great quietness that holds all stories, all lives, all moments of compassion and care. And perhaps, as you rest now in your own comfortable space, your breathing slow and steady, you carry a bit of that same healing tradition. Every time you offer comfort, every moment of patience with suffering, every gentle tending of what needs care, you continue what Marjorie began, what Elizabeth preserved, what Agnes transmitted. The garden grows wherever kindness takes root, wherever wisdom passes from one generation to the next, wherever healing happens in quietness and simplicity. The stars that watched over Marjorie's garden watch over you now. The same moon that lit her late-night remedy-making lights your rest. The earth that nourished her healing herbs holds you too, cradled in the great continuity of all life, all growth, all peaceful rest. And in this connection across centuries, across miles, across the space between then and now, there is a particular kind of peace, the peace of knowing that good work continues, that healing persists, that somewhere, always, gardens grow. Rest now, as Marjorie rested, as all healers must rest, to restore the energy that tomorrow's tending will require. Let the story settle into your bones, gentle as dried herbs settling in their jars, ready when needed, patient in the waiting, full of quiet potential. And if dreams come, perhaps they'll carry the scent of lavender, the wisdom of chamomile, the deep peace of gardens tended by loving hands through countless generations. The cottage sleeps, the garden sleeps, the tradition sleeps but never dies, only waits for morning, for the next hands to continue the work, for the next chapter in the endless story of healing. And you can sleep too, held by the same gentle darkness that held all those who came before, all those who found peace in the healer's cottage, all those whose suffering was eased by patient wisdom and herbal grace. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits, or perhaps just peaceful sleep.